At 47, George Cukor stood in his Hollywood mansion, hosting yet another glittering party. To the outside world, it looked like a social gathering of stars, producers, and dignitaries. But behind the velvet curtains, whispers told another story. These parties were more than cocktails and music. They were cover, a safe veil for secret liaisons in an industry that punished truth. Beneath the chandeliers, legends of the screen laughed, flirted, and hid in plain sight. For Cukor, the risk was immense. Exposure meant humiliation, career ruin, or worse. Yet he continued, night after night, because it was the only way to carve out moments of freedom in a world built on silence. How did a boy from immigrant roots rise to such heights, only to live under constant fear of discovery? To understand that, we must go back to his earliest days. George Dewey Cukor was born on July 7, 1899, in New York City. His parents, Victor and Helen Cukor, were Hungarian Jewish immigrants who carried with them the struggles of assimilation and the determination to succeed in America. The family lived in Manhattan, where George grew up, surrounded by the rhythm of a city changing at lightning speed. Horse-drawn carriages still rolled over cobblestone streets, but new skyscrapers were piercing the skyline, symbols of ambition and reinvention. As a boy, George was fascinated by the stage. The early 1900s were a golden period for theater in New York. Vaudeville houses blazed with electric lights, drawing crowds eager for music, comedy, and novelty. George, small and sharp-eyed, would sneak peeks at actors rehearsing, marveling at how a bare stage could transform into another world. His parents, practical and cautious, hoped he might pursue law or medicine, but George had already fallen in love with storytelling. The atmosphere of the era left its mark. Jazz was beginning to stir in smoky clubs. Women were marching for suffrage, their banners raised in defiance. And all around, waves of immigrants created neighborhoods alive with languages, aromas, and traditions. George absorbed it all, shaping a sensitivity that would later allow him to direct actors with uncanny precision. But alongside the excitement came unspoken danger. The early 20th century was a time of rigid social codes. Respectable men married, raised families, and lived within narrow expectations. To be different, especially in matters of love, was unthinkable. Homosexuality was whispered about in alleyways and condemned in pulpits. Young George, already aware of feelings he could not name, learned early to keep secrets. He attended DeWitt Clinton High School, a place known for producing bright minds in literature and art. Classmates noticed his sharp wit and his love of theater. By his late teens, he was working as an assistant stage manager in summer stock theaters, carrying props and memorizing the rhythms of dialogue. Each rehearsal was a revelation. Each performance confirmed what he already knew. His destiny was to create stories that could move people. By the 1,920 seconds, America was roaring with new energy. Flappers danced in fringe dresses, jazz records spun on Victrolas, and the movie industry was migrating from New York stages to California backlots. George, ambitious and restless, began to see a path westward. Broadway gave him his first taste of success, but Hollywood offered something grander. A chance to reach millions instead of hundreds. As he stood in the bustling streets of New York, he must have felt the pull of two worlds: the safety of anonymity and the promise of visibility. To choose Hollywood was to step into both opportunity and danger. The boy who once peeked through stage curtains was about to open a much larger door, one that led directly to the heart of the dream factory. When George Cukor arrived in Hollywood during the late 1,920 seconds, the industry was in chaos. Silent films were fading, and the new era of talkies demanded directors who understood actors, dialogue, and timing. Studios needed someone who could translate the rhythms of the stage into cinema, and George, with his theater background, was ready. His earliest work was as a dialogue coach for Paramount. Actors who looked magnificent on screen often struggled when sound arrived. Their voices awkward, their accents jarring. George, patient and perceptive, coaxed performances from them. Executives noticed. Soon, he was given a chance to direct. By the early 1,930 seconds, his reputation soared. He co-directed A Bill of Divorcement in 1932, which introduced a young Katharine Hepburn to audiences. The film's success announced Cukor as a new kind of director, one who could balance elegance with raw emotion. 2 years later, he guided Hepburn again in Little Women, 1933, a triumph that won hearts and critics alike. Hepburn would become one of his closest collaborators, and together, they crafted some of the finest performances of her career. Cukor had a gift for drawing extraordinary depth from his actors, especially women. He treated them with seriousness in an industry that often reduced them to ornaments. His sets became known as safe spaces where actresses like Greta Garbo, Joan Crawford, and Ingrid Bergman felt understood. This earned him the nickname the Women's Director, a label both admiring and limiting, but one he accepted with quiet pride. The 1930 seconds brought one success after another. He helmed David Copperfield in 1935, dazzling audiences with Dickens brought to life. Camille in 1936 gave Garbo one of her most unforgettable roles, her tragic beauty immortalized under Cukor's direction. He was chosen for Gone with the Wind in 1939, but his perfectionism and clashing with producer David O. Selznick led to his dismissal. Still, whispers on the lot suggested that Vivien Leigh and Olivia de Havilland secretly wished he had remained, for they trusted his instinct with actors above all else. Though setbacks came, George always found his footing again. The 1940 seconds saw The Philadelphia Story with Hepburn, Cary Grant, and James Stewart an enduring masterpiece of wit and romance. It cemented him as one of MGM's crown jewels. His style was unmistakable. Sophisticated dialogue, shimmering production design, and characters whose vulnerability shone through polished surfaces. But fame in Hollywood was never simple. As his reputation grew, so did the need for control over his image. Studios enforced morality clauses, gossip columnists thrived on rumor, and careers could collapse with a whisper. George, unmarried and discreet, knew he walked a fragile line. His art placed him in the spotlight, but his private life demanded shadows. The higher he climbed, the more dangerous that balance became. Hollywood in the 1930 seconds and 40 seconds sparkled on the surface. But behind closed doors, it ran on whispers and coded arrangements. George Cukor, now one of MGM's prize directors, lived at the center of this paradox. Outwardly, he was the consummate host, the genial bachelor who threw the finest gatherings in Beverly Hills. Inwardly, those gatherings became sanctuaries, lavish parties that shielded secrets too dangerous for the daylight. His home, a graceful estate with manicured lawns and discreet gates, became a legend in its own right. On weekend nights, the driveway filled with sleek Packards and Cadillacs. Stars glided in, their laughter echoing across the garden. To the uninvited, it was a glamorous salon, a place to see and be seen. But for those who understood, it was something more. Here, men who lived under constant scrutiny could breathe freely, if only for a few hours. George never flaunted his private life, but those who attended remembered the warmth of his welcome, the way he cultivated trust. Cary Grant, Laurence Olivier, Tyrone Power actors of towering fame were rumored to step through his doors. Some came simply for the security of companionship, others for more tender connections. In a world where studios dictated who a star could date and gossip columns could destroy a career, Cukor's house became a rare refuge. There were romances, though rarely spoken of aloud. Biographers suggest George shared deep affection with men who understood his burdens, men who also balanced desire with fear. The trysts were coded in discretion: late-night drives along Mulholland, private dinners away from cameras, vacations abroad where American reporters did not linger. Even within these circles, silence was currency. Names were guarded, letters destroyed, promises sealed by the risk they all carried. Yet secrecy carried a heavy cost. At times, the parties drew suspicion. Studio bosses wondered why their stars spent so many evenings at Cukor's home. Gossip columnists hinted at unusual gatherings. George responded by redoubling his charm, hosting charity galas, keeping his sets impeccable, never offering the press a misstep. Still, he knew the walls could not protect him completely. The strain of living between two worlds was profound. By day, he was the acclaimed director shaping Hollywood's finest films. By night, he navigated fragile networks of trust, knowing that one betrayal, one careless word, could undo everything. The irony was cruel. The man celebrated for capturing human intimacy on screen was forced to conceal his own. And as Hollywood grew ever more ruthless in policing image, the danger of exposure loomed larger. By the 1,950 seconds, George Cukor had everything a Hollywood director could desire: prestige, wealth, and a catalog of films admired across the world. But beneath that polished success, shadows crept closer. The industry was shifting. McCarthyism fueled paranoia, and morality clauses became sharper weapons. Studios, terrified of scandal, demanded spotless images from their stars and directors. For George, whose private life was an open secret among insiders, the risks multiplied. Rumors began to circulate in the press. Confidential magazine, notorious for its exposés, sniffed around his Beverly Hills parties. Columnists hinted at his bachelorhood with sly innuendo. For a man who had built a career on grace and discretion, these whispers cut deep. Though no major scandal broke into full daylight, the threat was constant. Every headline felt like a warning. The strain was not only external. Friends recalled moments when George, usually composed, would show flashes of worry. What if the wrong guest talked? What if a rival studio leaked stories to damage him? Hollywood was merciless. Careers had already been destroyed over rumors alone. Actors like Tab Hunter and Anthony Perkins lived in constant fear, their personal lives tightly managed by studios. George, with less protection, bore the weight largely alone. At times, the pressure impacted his work. He was removed from high-profile projects, officially for creative differences. Though whispers suggested moral unease played a part. Losing Gone with the Wind had stung years earlier. Later, battles with producers reinforced the feeling that he was always one misstep from professional exile. Yet the deepest wound came from isolation. While his parties gave brief reprieve, the morning after brought silence. He lived surrounded by people, yet often felt profoundly alone. The irony was striking. The man who gave audiences stories of love and connection was himself denied the freedom to live openly. Every secret romance carried the fear of exposure. Every friendship demanded careful navigation. The cost of concealment was heavy. He could not share joy publicly, nor lean on society for support. Instead, he buried himself in work, crafting elegant films while guarding fragile boundaries. The glitter of Hollywood, once dazzling, now felt like a cage. At the height of his career, George faced his lowest point not because of artistic failure, but because the truth of who he was remained the one thing he could never reveal. As Hollywood evolved through the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds, George Cukor adapted with remarkable resilience. While younger directors chased gritty realism, he stayed true to his elegant style. Films like My Fair Lady in 1964, which won him an Academy Award for Best Director, proved that his mastery of sophistication and character was timeless. The victory was sweet, a public crown for decades of artistry, even as his private world remained carefully veiled. By then, George was no longer the anxious young man hiding behind parties. Age brought perspective, even a kind of quiet defiance. He continued to host gatherings at his Beverly Hills home, though they mellowed with time. What once had been anxious hideaways for forbidden meetings became more relaxed salons, where old friends reminisced and younger artists sought his wisdom. The air of secrecy remained, but the fear of exposure softened as society began to change. In the 1,970 seconds, as the Stonewall movement stirred conversations about LGBTQ rights, George watched from the sidelines. He never came out publicly, never spoke directly of his private life, but he offered quiet support to friends who dared to live more openly. His circle remained strong, bound less by fear now than by loyalty and affection. Professionally, he shifted toward mentoring. Younger directors admired his patience with actors, his eye for detail, his belief that film should honor the human heart. He staged operas, continued to advise on scripts, and kept himself connected to the arts even as his era of dominance faded. Hollywood was no longer the factory of the 1,930 seconds. The old studio bosses were gone, and the world he had once navigated with such care had given way to a new generation. Yet George never expressed bitterness. Friends remembered his humor, his warmth, his unshakable sense of dignity. In his later years, he reflected on a career that had spanned half a century and survived storms that might have crushed others. He knew the price he had paid in secrecy, but he also recognized the victories. Films that endured, friendships that sustained him, and a legacy untouched by scandal. On January 24, 1983, George Cukor passed away at the age of 83. He left behind a home still filled with memories of laughter, music, and whispered confessions. In the end, he had lived as both a man of Hollywood and a man apart, a figure who navigated impossible choices with grace. His later years carried a kind of peace, the quiet knowledge that his work had outlasted the silence that once bound him. As Hollywood evolved through the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds, George Cukor adapted with remarkable resilience. While younger directors chased gritty realism, he stayed true to his elegant style. Films like My Fair Lady in 1964, which won him an Academy Award for Best Director, proved that his mastery of sophistication and character was timeless. The victory was sweet, a public crown for decades of artistry, even as his private world remained carefully veiled. By then, George was no longer the anxious young man hiding behind parties.